Greetings. We come to week 2 of our reflections upon the readings of Lent, this time for the second Sunday of Lent. And I'm going to share my screen. Our first reading is taken from chapter 12 of Genesis, the first 4 verses of it. This chapter is actually the beginning of the historical narrative of the Bible. Up to this time, we have been hearing prehistory in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, and they are concerned with origins, the origin of creation, the origin of the human family, the origin of the disaster of sin and evil. And it's narrated the way that sin and evil snowball, first within the family, Cain and Abel. And then it gets much worse than that. Finally, God decides to start over with Noah and destroys everything except for Noah, his family, and 2 of every animal. And that doesn't overcome sin then. It continues to snowball. And there is finally, in chapter 11 of Genesis, the story of the Tower of Babel, where now even all the nations of the earth are estranged from each other. They're divided by their languages. And so the alienation that is caused by sin is front and center by the time we get to chapter 12. It's against that background, then, that chapter 12 opens with God starting over again, but this time with a single person, with Abram. In the midst of the climate of sin and alienation among people, God calls Abram to start a journey by which he will ultimately be a blessing for all the communities of the earth. Abram has left his home country of Ur in what is now Iraq. He has gone to Haran in what is now northern Syria or southern Turkey. It's here that God calls him to undertake a journey to a land that God will promise to give him. This map shows the movement of Abram from when he left Ur to Haran, arriving eventually in Canaan, which was the promised land, and then to Egypt for a sojourn there before returning to Canaan. Abram is called to make an act of faith by leaving his home, to go to a land that is yet undetermined. God doesn't say where he's going to have him go. He must leave behind the security of his homeland, his larger family, and strike out in trust for an unknown country. God promises him descendants to make him a great nation. The last verse is very direct and clear. He left. He does what God asks him. He doesn't hesitate to undertake the journey. His faith is demonstrated from the beginning of his calling. Who was St. Timothy? In our first reading, it gives us the story of the call of Abram to be father of faith for many. The passage from the second letter of Paul to Timothy is about the call that Christians have received. So who was St. Timothy? He was born of parents who differed in their religion. His mother and grandmother were Jewish. His father was pagan. He becomes a Christian, as do his mother and grandmother. And then he becomes a collaborator and companion of St. Paul. Paul says at various times in his letters that Timothy was able to sort out problems among the communities that Paul and he visited. He seems to have had a very gentle spirit, as well as somewhat of a delicate health. He becomes overseer, episkopos, that is bishop of the great city of Ephesus in Asia Minor, what is now Turkey. This letter is addressed to him by Paul, although scholars believe it was probably not Paul himself, but one of his other disciples who wrote it in his name to give it greater authority. It's certainly inspired by Paul's understanding of the gospel. That call is based not on our merits, but on the plan God has unfolded from the beginning. This is the connection to the first reading. Abraham represents the first unfolding of that plan by God's call for him to undertake that journey of faith. That call has been made manifest. It has been revealed and communicated to us through Jesus Christ. Jesus has destroyed death and brought life and immortality to light. This is the connection to the gospel passage as well. The transfiguration of Jesus is a glimpse of what God is revealing through Jesus, the light and immortality of Jesus revealed in his glory, however briefly for the disciples at the time, but ultimately revealed in his resurrection. Perhaps the most striking verse of the passage is the first one. Bear your share of hardship for the gospel with the strength that comes from God. In our lifelong pilgrimage, we will face struggles, suffering, challenges, and hardships. St. Paul is advising Timothy to carry his own unique challenges in this regard by relying on the grace of God. Then we come to the gospel for this week. We hear one of the synoptic accounts of the Transfiguration on the second Sunday of Lent every year, just as we hear the temptations on the first Sunday. This year being the year of Matthew, we hear the Matthean account. It takes place on a mountain, the traditional place to encounter God and a place of prayer. This is a photo of Mount Tabor, which tradition says is the site of the Transfiguration. You can see the long winding road getting up to the top. This is also a church on top of the mountain that recalls the Transfiguration. And you can see the mosaic in the upper right corner of these two pictures, the depiction of the Transfiguration in what looks like to be a magnificent church. The change in Jesus's appearance in the Transfiguration recalls Exodus chapter 34 to verse 29, in which Moses' appearance is changed by encountering God on Mount Sinai. In this story, the face of Moses becomes so radiant from his meeting with God that he puts on a veil after his return to the camp. He has seen the glory of God, a gift given to him by God. It transforms his appearance, and his face reflects that glory. When Jesus is described as being transfigured by light and the brightness of the sun, he's being described as having a glory that normally is properly attributed to God. First century Jewish apocalyptic literature reflects a belief that Moses and Elijah would return before the end, when God would intervene to bring about his kingdom in its fullness. Moses represents the great lawgiver from the past, and Elijah, the great prophet. Peter wants to set up tents or tabernacles. The connection to the tabernacle in Exodus continues. The place where God's glory would overshadow in a cloud and Moses would converse with God. He wants to do this in order to keep this wonderful experience going. This picture shows the Jewish custom celebrated to this day of creating small shelters or tabernacles as a way to remember their ancestors' sojourn in the desert for 40 years. The cloud that comes over them recalls the cloud that would descend upon the tabernacle tent in the desert during the time of the sojourn there by the Israelites. It symbolizes the mysterious presence of God. The voice from heaven echoes the baptism of Jesus by declaring Jesus' special relationship to the Father. In Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 15, Moses says that God will raise up a prophet like Moses, and to him you shall listen. Now the voice tells the disciples to listen to Jesus. It singles out Jesus to be listened to in contradistinction to Moses and Elijah. Jesus is the fulfillment of that exhortation of Moses in Deuteronomy. Thus, the story proclaims that Jesus is the Son of God, God's final emissary, and the second Moses, who accomplishes the new Exodus. In the Bible, fear is consistently the human reaction to the appearance of the divine. For that reason, Jesus encourages the disciples to rise and not be afraid. Jesus also instructs them not to talk about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead, a reference to the passion of Jesus. The Transfiguration then has a reference to the suffering of the cross, the passage through death of Jesus. Luke makes this more explicit than Matthew by mentioning that Jesus converses with Elijah and Moses about his exodus he was to experience. Matthew does not remember this detail, yet both see the Transfiguration as a moment along Jesus' journey toward Calvary and the resurrection. It is remembered in the tradition of the church as a moment of glory for the special disciples to witness, so they would be prepared to understand the resurrection and ascension of Jesus later and to hold on to their faith in him when all would appear to be darkest as Jesus was put to death. The theme this week, therefore, I would say, is the call to faith and the journey of faith. Abram becomes the paradigm of the believer who uproots and journeys to an unknown country, trusting in God. Jesus follows his path a path not without encouragement from the Father in the experience of the Transfiguration. He will need to hold on to this experience, as forces that would try to destroy him will have their day. Jesus walking his path thus surely had to do with great faith, trusting in the Father's love in the face of others who rejected and persecuted him. We have received the call to faith, and we take hope because our striking out in faith will not be in vain, despite all appearances to the contrary. God has taken away death's power and revealed the possibilities of life and immortality through Jesus. We might therefore summarize the readings in this way. Our pilgrimage continues. We sometimes do not know the destination, the story of Abram. We must bear our share of hardships, Timothy. But God offers encouragement on the way. We too experience moments of transfiguration. I wish you well in your reflection this week.